Now, BBC News' Felicity Kvesic investigates the future of the professional game in England. Rucks and Riches.
It was almost like a bereavement. It was a major blow, really, and one we haven't really still come to terms with.
The overriding feeling of the players was we were kind of hung out to dry a little bit. To see a third club go out of the league was shocking, really, and you kind of wonder about the state of rugby.
I'd like to think we're at rock bottom and we're trying to move ourselves out. I just think it hurts a lot of people and hurts the game by obviously, unfortunately, what's falling to the bottom of the pile like Worcester.
Club owners and investors were taking a long-term view, but really, as soon as the pandemic hit, the risk that they were having to manage became totally unmanageable.
It was not a surprise that a rugby club was in danger. It was a surprise how quickly and how devastating the fall of the clubs was.
It was a season that shook fans to the core as English and European professional rugby faced its biggest crisis in 3 decades.
The World Cup here in France is a global celebration of the game and its challenges. The final here at the Stade de France puts an international spotlight on a sport that World Rugby says has grown 11% this year alone. But it comes at a time where the future of the professional game in England is unclear.
The Premiership rugby club Worcester Warriors have been suspended from all competitions after failing to meet a deadline set by the Rugby Football Union to provide a plan for their future funding. Worcester have debts of £25 million, including at least £6 million in unpaid tax.
Kvesic goes over the line.
For me as a reporter, understanding what's happened hasn't just been a professional journey. It's also been a personal one. My husband, Matt Kvesic, was one of the Worcester Warriors players who lost his job.
It was tough. There was so much uncertainty at the time, which I think was, that was probably the toughest bit, but almost the worst bit was there was also hope at the time as well. Rugby is a physical game. You don't want to be going into it with ifs and buts because that's when you get injured. Did we deep down really think it was going to come through? Probably not, with everything that was going on and the meetings we were having behind closed doors with Prem Rugby and the RFU. They wouldn't fill you with confidence, let's put it politely. The product on the pitch in the Premiership is brilliant. That was the thing last year. It was absolutely brilliant, but what was happening off it was a mess.
It's very strange seeing the place all quiet and a little bit run down, to be honest. It's quite sad, but we'll take away some really good memories.
Graham Kitchener enjoyed a long career in professional rugby, starting and finishing at Worcester Warriors, but it didn't end as he'd hoped.
Set myself in the last season in terms of, could I get to 200 Prem games? Could I play 300 sort of senior games, club games? And, it kind of sounds silly, but, all those were kind of sort of taken from me.
Bad news, eh? The dream's over, bro.
Shell-shocked players exchanging farewells this morning just minutes after learning they and hundreds of staff had lost their jobs.
Mate, I'm devastated. I'm absolutely devastated.
So I lost probably a couple of weeks after Worcester sort of went into liquidation. I think I'd only done a couple of days sort of training with them, and there was a meeting called in the afternoon, and the administrator and the sort of owner came in and had a sort of chat with the lads, and that was kind of basically it.
The Wasps' former owner, Chris Wright, says the club has got a very bleak future now after going into administration.
It's over, and it's the life and the passion and tradition for so many people that has gone, including myself. We always used to say, once a Wasp, always a Wasp.
Yeah, I would say even that day, it was a shock for me. Everyone was always positive about the name. It's a massive club with a massive history, and it wasn't something we wanted, but I probably did expect us to maybe a new owner to come in at some point.
With 2 clubs folding, the English Premiership had been rocked twice. Come the season finale at Twickenham, the league thought it could look to the future, but there was another shock to come.
The latest deadline for London Irish to prove that they have a future has passed, with the prospect of them becoming the third Premiership club within a year to be thrown out of the division.
The challenging part is that we weren't all together when we were told. Ultimately, it's a human story, isn't it? It's sadness, and a lot of people were hurt very badly by not being able to know where they were going to be. And at the end of it all, it was, a pretty harrowing time, really.
I think one of the major impacts has been COVID. Clubs in the Premiership rely heavily on ticket sales. So the fact that the stadiums were empty, that revenue wasn't coming in, you've then got as I say, the hospitality side, the merchandise. On the back of COVID, there hasn't been that influx of people back in the stadiums in the same way. And I think one of the major issues for rugby, which is very different to football, is that the business model is on its head. So the Premiership isn't the lucrative entity, it is the RFU, whereas in football, the FA is the underdog, if we can term it like that.
This is rooted way back when rugby went professional. It was the Wild West back in 95, 96 when the game went pro. But there was no infrastructure, there was no planning. And rugby has led a pretty much hand-to-mouth existence right through the professional game. And of course, the season just gone by, we've seen the culmination of problems that have been brewing. It was not a surprise that a rugby club was in danger. It was a surprise how quickly and how devastating the fall of the clubs was.
In 2019, Premiership rugby was on a high. 10 clubs made a profit, helped largely by a £200 million investment from the American firm CVC Capital Partners. But when the COVID pandemic hit the very next season, the financial effect was catastrophic. The Premiership thought it would protect itself by gradually expanding from 12 to 14 teams. But by 2022, every club that had filed its accounts reported a loss. And for 3 clubs, the debts became too much.
The latest accounts for Worcester Warriors were filed for the season ending in 2020 and showed they made a loss of just over £4 million that season. For Wasps, the situation was increasingly more serious. For the season ending in 2021, they made a loss of £7.4 million, with debts of £28.6 million. And London Irish's predicament was similar. At the end of the season 2021, they made a loss of £3.4 million, with debts of £28.3 million. In rugby terms, the situation had become unsustainable.
I'm Collins, my business partner Jason, and we're the owners of the Warriors.
In June 2019, Colin Goldring and businessman Jason Whittingham took on ownership of Worcester Warriors. When the club collapsed last year, it owed hundreds of suppliers, businesses, banks and ticket holders millions of pounds. Administrators have been carrying out detailed investigations into the club's finances. A scathing parliamentary inquiry criticised the RFU for not intervening in Goldring's ownership of Worcester after he'd been barred by a solicitor's disciplinary tribunal from being employed at any law firm without the regulator's permission over significant financial irregularities at the legal practice which had employed him. They went on to say the game is in disarray at the top, suffering from inert leadership, and the demise of the clubs was a stain on the reputation of the RFU and Premiership rugby.
I think you've got to look at owners and directors explicitly. Were they fit to be in office? So I think rugby can learn a great lesson here in terms of it needs to strengthen its owners and directors test, absolutely. It needs to make sure there's ongoing monitoring. There needs to be more transparency over accounts, the fact that Worcester filed accounts late.
Colin Goldring and Jason Whittingham declined to take part in this programme. They told the BBC any allegations that they did not act in the club's best interests were in complete ignorance of the facts and truth.
The overriding feeling of the players was, we were kind of hung out to dry a little bit. Could the RFU and Prem Rugby have done a little bit more to kind of help us and maybe get us through the season? The way they came across to us as players was that they weren't as concerned as we felt they could have been.
So I came in January 2022, and at that stage the league was operating under the model where there was very little central financial information about clubs. There was no obligation of clubs to report. And so really, what we were learning around club financial situation was either what they were choosing to give us. I think I would say that fit and proper tests are a moment in time, and I think they need to be more regular. It's not just a business here. This is a community asset. So this involves, not only the livelihoods of the people that work there, but also has a big impact on those communities. So we've put in place a financial monitoring panels.
Players and fans of the clubs involved have told us they were hung out to dry by the PRL and RFU. Do you think the PRL could have done more?
No, I think that the situation was so severe, principally because of the circumstances the clubs were in after the pandemic, that there was very little that could have been done. And so I think, with hindsight, what could have been put into place to control things a bit more was around financial control and monitoring and stuff that we're doing now. But the reality was it was so severe what had happened to these clubs during the pandemic that even with those types of measures, their fate was pretty much sealed. I think in hindsight, clubs should have perhaps considered more around just totally mothballing things.
But it wasn't just the men's rugby union team at Worcester that was affected. The Warriors remained in the Women's Premiership, although things have been a struggle.
It was just a massive, massive roller coaster. And I don't think at any point with the women I thought I ever wanted to accept that it was done. At the time when all this was happening, we had 14 players at the World Cup. And I didn't want to be in a position where I'd have to ring them up and say, you haven't got a club to come home to.
After securing new financial backing, Worcester Warriors women had been determined not to follow their male counterparts.
The women's game have got the opportunity to learn still. We're still relatively new, so we've got an opportunity to learn from the men. So we have to be really smart with how we grow and are sustainable. So there's no point in having this massive increase in player salaries if we haven't got the money coming in.
Just before this programme went to air, Worcester Warriors women announced their external funding had ceased, and they pulled out of this season's league and cup competitions. In Worcester is Six Ways. It's a rugby ground, an asset where rugby can still be played. It's something Wasps don't have, with a history dating back more than 150 years and 6 times Premiership champions. Wasps were also twice Champions Cup winners and part of the European elite. The nomadic London club bought and moved to Coventry's Ricoh Arena in 2014. It was a bold relocation, part funded by selling investment bonds to supporters. It didn't pay off.
And as you enjoying something tasty at the Ricoh?
It was almost like a bereavement. I wasn't expecting this. We've been around Wasps and supporting them in their family for over 20 years. And then suddenly that was taken away. This was our weekend's activity as a family. The Ricoh was seen by us as a good move. Others didn't see it that way, particularly those that were wedded to London Wasps, as it was, and had a proud heritage in that regard.
For Wasps, they had a big plan, and it kind of looked as though it was going to work, and I would imagine the pandemic had a massive impact. Their revenue streams just dried up.
We were first introduced in an advisory capacity by the board, who'd been looking to refinance, because the fundamental problem they had a huge debt pile. They had a debt pile of more than 100 million in the group, and they had the retail bondholders who were in for 36 million. They were trying to get a refinance, and despite all their best efforts, it didn't come to fruition. So in the end, they just ran out of cash.
I think the move to the Ricoh did contribute to, I would say, the demise of Wasps, but I think it goes back earlier. When Wasps were at Adams Park, they did try to seek secondary rugby income by building a new stadium there. So there was a lot of investment and time put into that adventure, which unfortunately failed at the last hurdle. So I think there's always a balance with rugby clubs between being a rugby business and then also the non-rugby income, which is important.
What do you think were the main reasons for the collapse?
Oh, I don't know. The bond was obviously a massive issue in terms of Wasps. The club took a massive gamble, didn't it, and got coming up to the Midlands from London. COVID definitely did not help the situation at all, and Is it funny after a couple of years people get loans and everything to get themselves through COVID that a couple of years later there's 3 clubs go within 1 year? So I think that's got a lot to do with I think we did really well as a sport actually at the time when you think about it.
We're seeing the problem of trying to force a club to exist, force a name, force a location, force a fan base. Rugby's organic, rugby grows, and rugby knows where it belongs. It knows where the club lives and where it exists. If you try and force it, you've got to work bloody hard to make it work.
London Irish had a proud history in southwest London, but like Wasps, they became nomadic. First sharing Reading's Madejski Stadium before moving in with Brentford Football Club in 2020.
For London Irish, a club needs a home. You've got to have a home. They thought Brentford would be the answer, and it wasn't the answer. Big fees, big salaries were spent to keep them competitive. They couldn't generate their home there, so they went searching for it, and it didn't work.
Owner Mick Crossan had been bailing out London Irish for a decade. When his attempts to sell the club to a US consortium failed, the club folded.
I don't know if we will all move on completely. Yeah, it's a weird feeling to know that you look back in the following season, your team doesn't exist anymore. Yeah, that's a really hard thing to put into place.
During the COVID pandemic, the UK government gave emergency loans to England's Premiership clubs to keep them afloat. It loaded millions of pounds of debt onto the clubs, debt they have to pay back.
Do you think that was the right thing to do? Because was it not just delaying the inevitable?
No, because they would have thought, well, these are clubs in a competitive league. They've got TV rights. They've got money from CVC. Rugby is a popular sport. It's the Six Nations generates huge interest. So clubs are stressed without a doubt. But they needed that money. They had to have that money, otherwise the game would have collapsed.
I don't think we would have a Premiership if those loans hadn't been put in place. It's an incredible pressure because they're not insignificant amounts, and I think the clubs didn't have any choice at the time.
Without them, as I say, all clubs would have gone bust. But I think they quite quickly became a burden because then there is the further burden of having to pay back these loans, which are taxpayers' money. We are looking to manage those things, and so I see a positive outcome with all that.
I think there was a stat, something like 90% of Wasps fans aren't watching rugby anymore. From a sport that we need to create, we need to get more and more supporters in, we've potentially lost people.
Rugby needs to realise it's not as big as it thinks it is. It's going for global domination, but I think it's overreached itself. But at the moment, it's this mess. No one knows. Seasons are uncontrolled. You pay your ticket, you don't see your star players. It's a mess. It needs to be timed up.
I mean, that's one of the things we are tidying up. So we want our international players to be available much more for clubs, and clearly they're not if you've got a calendar that's overlapping. So that's one of the benefits of having a 10-team league. And so you can now say to fans that when you come and watch, the England stars will be there. We also need to balance that with having regional representation across the country. And so what exists in the Premiership is a 10-team Premiership, but this is why we want to align ourselves much more with the Championship. We need to bridge that gap. We need to make it smaller, but I firmly believe we need a national footprint of elite clubs. There's a whole stabilisation plan, which really is a sort of 4 to 5 year period where we're trying to get funding certainty. Some of that is our partnership with the RFU and how the professional game is managed and how we've become much closer and deal with things much more as a sort of one entity approach rather than as two sort of sides of a coin.
Fans have been lost to the game and the league can't afford that. What do you make of that?
I think the sort of message to Wasps and Worcester fans is please stay loyal to your club and let us work on a system where we can get them back to top flight as soon as possible. I really want them to be part of the Championship as soon as possible because they're such great brands and they're so important to the fabric of rugby in this country. And I think that's now part of the mission is to try and resuscitate those brands and make them what they were again.
In 1999, both Richmond and London Scottish boomed briefly and then went bust. Clubs, including London Welsh, have had to start again. None has made it back to top flight. So should Premiership clubs be treated differently?
Yeah, I think that's a really important point. So that's what you need to balance. It's the aspiration of clubs, and it's also the system that exists, rightly or wrongly, around promotion, relegation, and what happens when clubs go into insolvency. So that's a very difficult debate to have.
I think the huge success that women's sport is having across all sports, but particularly the Lionesses, is just going to see non-international rugby union, club rugby union, go further down, I think, and I'm not so sure that those revenues will be there from television companies. I sort of feel that the spend is more likely to be towards women's sport.
Of course, there's other interests and other competing interests, and so that's where we need to focus with growth, and really we're trying to focus on the younger demographic and also families much more.
As a rugby fan, an avid rugby fan, I'd like to see more collaboration between the Premiership and the RFU, but it's got to be meaningful and transparent. If we're not careful, I think as a sport, you're going to see more players moving off to France.
The consequences of England's professional clubs struggling has a ripple effect beyond borders. Here in France, the salary cap, which is the amount professional clubs can pay players, is greater than that of the Premiership. It means many of the Premiership star players are moving abroad.
Henry Arundel, Jack Willis and David Ribbons are all England World Cup players who have already moved to the top 14 in France, with more set to follow.
There are a bigger market there, so the gap between football and rugby is smaller and more equal than it is clearly here. So it's a bigger market and probably more dominant.
The RFU announced they'd be looking to create hybrid contracts for around 25 players in a move to stem the flow of those leaving.
Players generally have a short playing career, so they need to make as much money as they possibly can and also develop prospects for career transition.
If you look at the scenes in France, it's pretty special. There's a lot of people over here jealous of what they're doing with the game over there.
Just off the French coast, though, lies Jersey, a rising club. Last season's championship winners and with big ambitions. That was until this season. Faced with uncertainty over central funding, a potential investor pulled out and the club ceased trading. A fourth club to go bust in 12 months.
I had no prior knowledge whatsoever, and that is a real kick in the teeth. The abruptness and lack of warning has meant that 70 people with families and children are now left in the dark, unemployed, potentially having to leave the island pretty quickly. And with children in school and things like that, and jobs and livelihoods and rents and mortgages, it's unbelievable that it's been allowed to happen as abruptly.
Jersey Reds said their accounts have been consistently and openly shared with the government of Jersey. But the state's assembly voted against using public funds to help the professional sports team when its assets were extremely unclear. In a statement, the Rugby Football Union said they had launched a hardship fund for players and staff in need of financial support. They added, "The discussions currently taking place about the structure of the professional game partnership present us with a real opportunity to remodel and to create a more sustainable game for professional rugby. Naturally, we'd love to see Worcester Warriors, Wasps and London Irish back in the elite game. The insolvency regulations are currently structured as they are to prevent clubs being able to wipe out debt with no consequence."
What do you expect from the next season? Will all of these clubs survive and get through?
I don't know. I hope so. I really hope so. I do not want to see any other clubs go to the wall. And I want this now to be the catalyst for a more collaborative leagues. I'd like to see it extend further down than just the Premiership. And rugby has to put in place strict financial structures to make sure this doesn't happen again.
I guess the ideal is you want settled teams with the ability to bring those young English players through, with also giving clubs the ability to sign one or two really good maybe perhaps overseas players, or quality internationals who are going to help those young players. That's the ideal.
It's a special club. There's a big history about it. They've won, within the last couple of decades, they've won Premiership titles, won European. It doesn't get any bigger at club level than that.
It's interesting when people say to me, so who are you going to support now? And I go, I don't really want to support anybody. I'm still with Wasps, so I think a lot of supporters like me who are desperate to see them back and being successful again. And I think it will happen.
London Irish still exists as an amateur club, and there's a thriving amateur game there, and a lot of kids turn up every Saturday, Sunday up at Hazelwood, to play there, to do what they love as kids. So that still lives, and when something like that still lives, maybe there's hope.
They were a good team, and now it's just annoying that we can't watch them.
I'm going to probably support Harlequins because I know someone that plays for Harlequins in the girls' team.
I'll probably support Harlequins. Yeah.
Why Quins?
Because I heard that they also play good.
I do live quite close to Harlequins, so my dad said I should support Harlequins, but I don't want to.
You know, it's called grassroots for a reason. Clubs are like plants. They need healthy roots to survive. Club owners may come and go. Club fortunes may rise and fall. But keep the roots healthy and you'll keep the club alive. Keep the roots healthy and you'll guarantee the future of the sport.